Greetings all CHP listeners. Thanks for coming back for more Qing-era plant hunting. Part 2 this time. You're listening to the China History Podcast, and I'm your host, Laszlo Montgomery. Since 2010, if you will. Last time, we looked at the early plant hunters who came from Europe to China. And we saw how, in the beginning at least, those carrying out all manners of botanizing were doing this only as a side activity, and by no means was plant collecting a top priority, and certainly not their area of expertise. Not until the mid-1800s did a gaggle of trained professional botanists start arriving in China. From the earliest explorations carried out by Portuguese Jesuits in the 16th century up until the early 19th century, plant hunting was carried out as a, while you're out there, can you also look for new plant species kind of thing. After the treaty ports started opening, and with the well-known success of Robert Fortune in China between 1843 and 1851, plant hunters the world over started migrating in the general direction of China. And after 1860, everyone's favorite foreign imperialist powers and their unequal treaties had gamed the system sufficiently enough so that anyone could go almost anywhere in China and proselytize, engage in commerce, sell weapons, or seek out new plant specimens. No more restrictions, and what restrictions there were, someone would find a way to flout them. By Fortune's time in the mid-19th century, enough had already been brought back from China for commercial horticulturalists with a discerning eye for nice profits to take notice. And this added another layer to this world of plant hunting in China. Though he was a diplomat first and an amateur botanist second, another important figure from this new world, almost as consequential as Fortune, was Henry Fletcher Hance, 1827 to 1886. He wasn't a Robert Fortune kind of character. Old Hance, as he came to be known in his later years, was this tremendously likable guy who did much to advance the study of plant exploration in China, and as a 19th century file server where information could be accessed and shared. Hance had gone to Hong Kong early in his life, age 17, starting at the bottom and working his way up the diplomatic ladder. And by his 20s, he was regularly exploring for plants in Hong Kong and always adding to his budding collection. And as he moved around to various diplomatic posts, wherever he was assigned, Hance would spend his spare time doing that thing he loved. He also got to visit Hainan and carried out some investigations of the plants there. He served in a number of positions as vice-consul and consul, most notably at Whampoa, today's Huangpu, on the eastern end of Guangzhou. Like all these other part-time botanists, Hance had a day job that kept him quite preoccupied. Nonetheless, wherever he served, in Fujian or Guangdong, he would find time to explore, identify, and taxonomically classify the plants he encountered or that were brought to him by others. As a diplomat, Hance was part of a network of people from many nations, and as I said, plant specimens and information was widely shared among this network in China and in Europe. In time, old Hance became a kind of goodwill ambassador for many an amateur or aspiring botanist serving or living in China. And this informal network of plant hunters would collectively send Hance their new specimens that he, in turn, would forward on to Kew Gardens in London. Henry Fletcher Hance was honored with many species named for him that bore the name Hancea. In 1878, he became a fellow at the Linnaean Society of London. He wrote over 200 papers and articles for journals about the plants he discovered in China. When Hance passed away in China, he left behind a herbarium collection of 22,437 species, later donated to the British Museum. And these, in turn, helped in the wider dissemination of knowledge and understanding of the flora of China. He's buried in Hong Kong Cemetery in Happy Valley, in good company with Sir Robert Ho Tong and Sir Paul Chater. So you could see from last time and into the second half of the 1800s, while all the other China history that we're all so familiar with was happening in the background, the rebellions, the natural disasters, the fallout from the degradation of the Manchu Qing imperial court. Besides all that, you also had this whole other dynamic plant hunting subculture going on quietly in the background. Let me move on to Augustine Henry. He was also an important name to remember from this world at the fin de siècle of the 1800s and into the 1900s. Augustine Henry's story and how it led to Charles Sprague Sargent and then to Ernest Wilson is one of the marquee stories of this golden age of plant hunting, as it came to be called in many sources. To tell this story, we first have to back up a little and start with Père Armand David, or Père David, Father David, as he became known in historical writing. Aside from what I'm going to tell you about his discovery of the handkerchief tree, he's best remembered as the first Westerner to observe a panda in the wild. While spending time serving in Sichuan, Father David was first shown a panda skin. Not long after, he saw one or several of these creatures in a forest. Père David also has a species of deer named after him. Père David's deer. In Chinese, that's a mi lu. He first observed this species in China in the 1860s in the mountains west of Chengdu. He also had a rat snake named for him as well. Father David was a French religious cleric who, in a similar tradition going back to the 16th century Jesuit fathers, tried to spread his faith and tend to his flock out in that western part of China. But at the same time, he religiously carried out a very vigorous survey of his natural surrounding. He's remembered more for the zoological specimens rather than the botanical discoveries he forwarded on to the Jardin des Plantes. But he was no less a man of adventure and talent than Robert Fortune was, just in a different way. So, in 1868, Père David wrote about seeing a handkerchief tree, named for its numerous handkerchief-like flowers that hang from the branches. It's very striking when you see one in full bloom. In some places, they call it a dove tree. It's also called a ghost tree. The flowers are actually bracts. Bracts are specialized leaves located usually just below the flower. Some are small and some are quite prominent, like with the handkerchief tree. The red petals of the poinsettia are not petals. That's a bract. Same with the bougainvillea. The main attraction is the colorful bract, not the flower. Bracts serve to either protect the flower or serve as something in nature that attracts pollinating birds, bees, butterflies, and bats. Père David wrote about it, took cuttings, and sent his findings on to his handlers in Europe. And from that time on, this botanically unique tree, named for Père David, Davidia involucrata, with its ornamental handkerchief-like bracts and yellow leaves in the fall, struck a chord with the horticulturally minded back in Europe, and it sort of became this kind of holy grail for plant hunters and plant nurseries as the decades passed. Then one day, Augustine Henry came along and spotted one not far from Yichang, Hubei province, where he worked as an officer in the customs service. Henry had been recruited by none other than Sir Robert Hart himself. He did his longest stretch for the customs service in China in Yichang, but he also served in Shanghai and in Simao, Yunnan province, today the city of Pu'er. I'm not sure about his service to China Maritime Customs, but as far as Augustine Henry's contributions to the field of botany, they were quite profound in their day. Though Irish by ancestry, Henry was born in Dundee, Scotland, but grew up in Cookstown, County Tyrone, Northern Ireland. He was educated as a surgeon and ended up in China as a medical officer. But, like we've seen, the story of European plant hunting in China was written mostly by men like Augustine Henry, who, though not in China solely to collect plants, nonetheless devoted a great amount of his time engaging in this passion of his. And not only that, he also paid other local Chinese to engage in seeking out new specimens. And over the period of his time in China, beginning in 1881, he compiled a massive collection of herbaria and specimens. And like Hance, Augustine Henry also served as a repository of information who helped advance the science more widely. Henry, too, sent varieties of camellias, magnolias, and rhododendrons back to England. You know, there are anywhere from 100 to 300 species of camellias in East Asia. In the Northern Hemisphere, there's over 1,000 species of rhododendrons. So keep that in mind. Discovering 5-10 species of certain families of plants is sometimes just a small percentage of what's out there. The Asteraceae or daisy family has 30-something thousand species found across 1,900 genera. And because of the scope of all that Augustine Henry specialized in as far as Chinese flora went, his work in compiling data, organizing it, disseminating it, and serving as a walking, talking search engine for Chinese botanical specimens, he added mightily to the foundation on which 20th century Western plant hunters carried out their work in Asia. And one of his achievements was in how he bridged the understanding of Asian plants in the West. He made a dent in the identification of tens of thousands of species of flora in China. Henry's collection was particularly noteworthy because up till his time at least, almost everything that was known about Chinese botany in Europe was limited to areas close to Macau, Guangzhou, Zhoushan, Ningbo, and Beijing. Henry did the lion's share of his work inland, based in the city of Yichang. If you look on a map of China, you'll see that's pretty deep into central China. It's right on the banks of the Yangtze River and surrounded by the Qinling and Daba Mountains. What else could a plant hunter dream of? All in all, he and his collectors found 1,726 species, all of which were newly introduced to the West. And he, too, faced the same calamities as past plant hunters, losing quite a bit of plants and seed specimens and herbaria to many of the well-known troubles associated with transportation. Augustine Henry was never able to procure one, but he wrote about seeing a handkerchief tree somewhere in the mountains surrounding Yichang. This made him the second Westerner to spot one of these elusive trees. Throughout his period in China, Augustine Henry kept up a regular letter-writing regimen with his counterparts at Kew Gardens, and he had written to them about the urgency to send more resources to explore this part of China. In his letter, he said, quote, "I doubt if many of my specimens will be collected again for 50 years. So great is the variety and beauty of the Chinese flora, and so fit are the plants for European climate, that an effort should be made to send out a small expedition, preferably led by a university-trained botanist. Don't send a collector, but a gentleman, a student, and an enthusiast," end quote. And he further added, enticing them with the biodiversity of the region, quote, "Just a few days upriver from Yichang was the Klondike of plant gold," end quote. He was referring to the Klondike region of Yukon, Canada, where gold had just been discovered a few years prior in 1896. Augustine Henry strongly urged his colleagues at Kew Gardens to consider this expedition. He even mapped it all out, gave all the particulars and estimated costs, and sent that on. Well, Kew Gardens didn't have the funds in their budget to underwrite this kind of expedition, so the people there went to someone who they knew had the spare change to fund this venture. This was the Veitch Royal Exotic Nursery, better known as James Veitch and Sons. They too jumped at the commercial potential of the recently invented Wardian cases, and 5 generations of the Veitch family sent out 24 plant hunters all around the world to collect specimens that they might grow and sell in their chain of nurseries. Among Veitch's customers were many of the great English estates and gardens of the day. They had plenty of competition, but for at least a while, they were the most reputable nursery in the trade. They sold to a very solid market of competitive gardeners who coveted these prized ornamental flowering plants from China. By the close of the 19th century, there was a dread among the nursery trade that all the best plants had already been discovered in China. So Veitch, on the advice of his close colleagues at Kew Gardens, who had received it from such a celebrated name as Augustine Henry, ponied up the funding to send a plant hunter out into China's botanical terra incognitas to find any prize species that, for many of his customers, would serve as a kind of floral status symbol. Veitch Nurseries bravely chose a 23-year-old plant hunter with a scientific and botanical background who showed early promise as a gardener at Kew. This was Ernest Henry Wilson. The first chapter of his China story was told between 1899 and 1905. Wilson was contracted to Veitch to do some plant hunting in China. There was no specific mention in the contract about the handkerchief tree, Davidia involucrata. His general assignment was, quote, to procure trees, plants, and seeds of plants likely to prove hardy in this country, end quote, meaning England, of course. But there was a general understanding that, although the handkerchief tree wasn't the sole species targeted on this mission, it was the main one. Wilson took a very circuitous voyage to China, heading first to Boston to meet with an American legend in the field of botany, Charles Sprague Sargent. He was the first director of the world-famous Harvard University's Arnold Arboretum. Wilson spent 5 days there with Sargent, received a few good tips, and was given an introduction to meet with Augustine Henry, who would be leaving China soon to sail to Europe. Wilson then took the Transcontinental Railroad to San Francisco, and like thousands upon thousands of returning Chinese gold miners and railroad workers before him, sailed to the port of Hong Kong. He reached there in early June 1899. From Hong Kong, he went straight to Simao in Yunnan province to meet with Augustine Henry, who had delayed his departure from China in order to meet with Wilson and properly brief him. And once this was done, Wilson was given a vague map which provided him with a location for the handkerchief tree that Augustine Henry himself had seen in the mountains above Yichang. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The map covered an area of more than 50,000 square miles, and he was looking for one single tree somewhere in the mountains of Hubei province. Lots of luck. Nonetheless, Ernest Wilson made his way to Yichang, whereupon, using this map and all the guides and collectors who accompanied him, he set out. And on April 25th, 1900, not that long after conferring with Augustine Henry, he managed to stumble into the exact location of this one Davidia involucrata tree. But all that remained was the stump. A local resident had chopped it down and used the wood to build a house. These are not bushes. The handkerchief tree grows as tall as 60 to 80 feet, 20 to 25 meters. Can you imagine the letdown after coming this far? Ernest Wilson didn't let that deter him. He continued on with his botanizing. A few weeks later, he got lucky and walked right into a grove of 11 Davidia involucrata trees. The elusive handkerchief tree, or ghost tree, or dove tree. And not only that, they were in full flower. This was in May 1900, a month before the Boxers converged on Beijing and all the Westerners sought refuge in the legation quarter. Nonetheless, Ernest Wilson, with his trained eye and all the experience he managed to accumulate in his short career, took meticulous notes and drawings. Lastly, he collected as many seeds as he could carry and had them all properly packed up in ward cases and forwarded on to James Veitch and Sons in the UK. What Fortune's achievement on his first 2 trips did for his celebrity share price? That's what this discovery of the handkerchief tree did for Ernest Henry Wilson. Well, this is a little controversial. How much of the story was embellished by Wilson and how personally deserving he was for this discovery? Still up for debate. In any case, just like that Lufthansa heist at JFK did for Henry Hill, this discovery made Wilson. He proved to be the most successful and prolific collector James Veitch & Sons Royal Exotic Nursery ever had. The piles of seeds, bulbs, and tubers that Wilson procured for Veitch & Sons allowed them to dominate the market with a steady stream of new plants, shrubs, and perennials that had the gardening public always clamoring for more. Ernest Wilson fulfilled his contract with Veitch, and they parted ways. I'll spare you the details. And in 1906, he parlayed his success in commercial plant hunting in China into a position with the Arnold Arboretum. He was hired by its first director, who I said was Charles Sargent. Sargent served at the Arnold Arboretum from 1872 to 1927. That's as long as the Kangxi Emperor's reign, starting from the day he got rid of the regency and began his personal rule. Sargent's area of particular expertise was trees, or dendrology, more than plants. But he was, in his day, an acknowledged giant in this field. And like plenty of botanists before and after him, Sargent had a lot of species named for him. When Wilson first met with Sargent, he was a relative nobody. But now he was a somebody, thanks to that good fortune he had on that plant hunting expedition to China for Veitch & Sons. So Sargent hired Wilson to lead an expedition to China, Korea, Japan, and India. And that's where he launched his distinguished career as a collector for Harvard's Arnold Arboretum. As far as his previous position as a commercial collector, that was played down as something that was now beneath a botanist of his station in life. He carried out 2 more trips to China in 1907 to 1909 and again the following year from 1910 to 1911. And it was on that later trip where he suffered a nasty fall in Sichuan, in Wenchuan, where that terrible earthquake happened on May 12, 2008. He broke his leg pretty badly and out in the middle of nowhere to boot. So that put a damper on his future plant hunting career, at least in these rugged kinds of places. Plant hunting, by the time of Ernest Wilson, had become a big business. Thanks to all the advances in transport and logistics, everyone was throwing their hat in the ring, prospecting for that as yet undiscovered ornamental flower that could thrive in their respective home markets, wherever in the world they may have come from. Besides these corporate concerns contracting freelance botanists to do their prospecting, there were also rich, private individuals like Joseph Banks who got in on the action of funding these plant hunting expeditions to China. This period, in the first few decades of the 20th century, in China at least, was called the Golden Age of plant hunting. Ernest Wilson did well. From his humble beginnings as a 20-something go-getter prospecting for Veitch & Sons, he turned that into an even bigger and more celebrated position with the Arnold Arboretum. I read during his 5 trips to China between 1899 and 1918, he and his local collectors were responsible for about 65,000 plant specimens, most from Western China. In his book, published in 1913, he called China, quote, the mother of the world's gardens, end quote. He claimed that China was the origin of the lemon, citron, peaches, apricots, and the so-called European walnut. I read that in almost every major garden in the British Isles, there's at least one flower or plant that was introduced there by Ernest Wilson. Remember Charles George Gordon? In Chinese history, he was put in command of the ever-victorious army during the Taiping Rebellion, and among the monikers ascribed to him was Chinese Gordon. Well, Ernest Wilson was given the same street cred, and in his day, because of his many renowned exploits in China, they referred to him as Chinese Wilson. That's another one of those, sounded great 100 years ago, but not so much in 2025. Speaking of lemons, the Meyer lemon is a nice China story. In Mandarin, it's called the Mi Gan Ningmeng. You've probably seen them before in Whole Foods, upscale food grocers, or farmers markets. This is a hybrid citrus fruit that's a cross between a citron and a mandarin orange pomelo hybrid. They were introduced to the U.S. from China in 1908, and as the name suggests, it was discovered by a U.S. Department of Agriculture plant collector named Frank Meyer. He was a Dutch immigrant to the U.S., and Frank Meyer was the one who discovered this species of citrus that the Chinese had known about for 2,000 years at least. Back in the 1970s, it became a must-have ingredient for all those high-end restaurateurs who would drop that Meyer lemon name in their menu. It's sweeter, less acidic, less tart, nice floral fragrance, thin skin, and lots of juice. And you won't have to get a second mortgage on your house to buy them either. $4 to $6 a pound is all they'll set you back. Frank Meyer had a very interesting career and traveled throughout the world for the USDA, making discovery after discovery. But he died in China in June 1918, caught up in civil unrest and dying mysteriously on a riverboat sailing down the Yangtze toward Shanghai. I haven't mentioned this yet, but amateur and trained plant collectors, going back to the time of the Portuguese, for more than 300 years, a lot of them died quietly and without notice from disease, injuries suffered during the course of their work, or like Meyer, getting caught up in the Chinese history of their time, which they fell victim to in the end. I mentioned this in the History of Tea series, that these people, these plant hunters, so dangerous and exciting were their exploits, they were the Indiana Joneses of their day. Let me turn now to George Forrest. Along with Ernest Wilson, he was perhaps the biggest name in the world of plant hunting at the turn of the century. He lived 1873 to 1932 and came from the central lowlands of Scotland, from the town of Falkirk, about midway between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And like my wife, he was one of 13 kids. Early in his life, he tried his luck in Australia, working in the gold mines and on a sheep farm. By 1903, he was back in Scotland, where circumstances led him to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and ultimately to a man named Arthur K. Bully, someone who had done quite well as a cotton broker in Liverpool, home of you-know-who. Bully also owned a nursery in Cheshire called Bees Limited. Like their competitor, James Veitch and Sons, Bees was always on the lookout for new species and to be first to market with any new species in the home country. Bully was running a contest to find qualified adventurers to do some plant hunting in the southwest of China, mostly in Yunnan and the eastern Himalayas. Thanks to a recommendation from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Forrest was selected for the job, and in early 1904 he set out for what would be the first of 7 trips to China between 1904 and 1932. In August of 1904, he found himself in the town of Tengyue, today called Tengchong. This place has a history dating back to the Han and had served as an important stop along the southwestern Silk Road. It's right on the border with Burma, or Myanmar if you prefer, and there he met up with George Lytton. A quick word about him. Lytton served as the British consul down there following the final upshot of the 1875 Marjorie affair, mentioned in previous CHP episodes, and as a result of this tragedy, Britain was able to strong-arm the Qing government into granting them an outpost in Tengyue, where they hoped to use this area as their backdoor into China. And this was all mentioned in that History of Yunnan series. Lytton headed up the British presence in Tengyue, and to say this was a lonely outpost in the middle of nowhere is quite the understatement. It was quite a big deal when any Westerners came through those parts, so he gladly acted as Forrest's guide during the first plant hunting expedition, which would take Forrest to Zhejiang, very near the Yunnan-Tibet border. This is the eastern part of the Kham Kingdom of Tibet. French Catholic missionaries had been operating out of this area for a very long time. At the time of Forrest's plant hunting activities in and around Zhejiang, there was a rather nasty bit of unrest going on that The following year would turn into a full-fledged, bloody, and violent uprising. It all started with the Qing government trying to assert control there and the Tibetan lamas resisting their incursions and lashing out at anyone perceived as friendly to the Qing, including these French missionaries. But Lytton was an old hand in this part of China and successfully managed to avoid any of the unrest. And when it was all over, Lytton led Forrest back to Tongyue with seeds for 78 new species and several hundred herbaria of specimens found along the way. When they set out again the following year in April 1905, they wouldn't be so lucky. For this second outing, the two Georges, Forrest and Lytton, based themselves in Cizhong, and despite dire warnings that summer from the French living round those parts, he carried out his plant hunting. Forrest was fortunate in that during his early trips to Yunnan, he put together a crack team of local assistants who made all the difference in the success he had in all three provinces he operated in over 30 years, namely northwest Yunnan, southeast Tibet, and southern Sichuan, some very rough and remote parts of China. Whilst operating around Cizhong, things began to get extremely heated and dangerous. He and Lytton walked right into the Batang uprising of 1905. The French operating there had managed to hold off the occasional attacks from Tibetan antagonizers who wanted them out of their world that was more and more being invaded, not only by the Qing military, but by the British as well, trying to establish their foothold in the region. First, these lamas, called Dabdabs in some history books, went on the rampage and started killing Qing soldiers, trying to establish a presence there. And then they went after the French missionaries. Between March and July 1905, extreme amounts of violence was meted out against the French by these self-appointed soldiers or enforcers for their monasteries. The descriptions of how they got a hold of French priests and tortured and killed them were quite gruesome, I must say. Forrest was partly to blame. So magnificent was the plant hunting going on, and so overwhelmed was he in his mission, he ignored the dire warnings from the French, and by the time he decided to cut and run to escape the carnage, it was already too late. Everyone in his party got captured and killed. In a well-documented escape, Forrest evaded the Dabdabs for 8 days before he wandered into a group of local indigenous Li Su people who took him in, brought him back to life by feeding him and attending to his worst wounds and getting him back to Tongyue. So he survived, and in some very rugged, unforgiving mountain terrain. And as far as all the seeds, photo negatives, and everything he and his French assistants had collected up to that point, that also fell victim to the Batang uprising. George Lytton would die not long afterwards of disease and was buried in a special cemetery on Laifeng Mountain that had been reserved for those customs employees working in Tongyue. I'll have a link to David Lefman's piece called Death of a Consul if you'd like to read something that will wear you out with exhaustion. It describes Lytton's world there and his adventures with George Forrest. I don't think I ever mentioned this in a previous CHP episode, but after all that blood spilled, the Qing military went on a shock and awe punitive expedition and snuffed this whole movement out. There was a very famous Qing general, Zhao Erfeng, who went down in history as the Butcher of Kham, the part of eastern Tibet where most of the uprisings were happening. The monastery that played the leading role in the uprising was decimated. It was wiped out to the last defender. This was in 1906, and Zhao Erfeng kept the pressure on in that part of the Qing Empire until 1911, when he himself was executed by Republican forces a couple months following the Wuchang uprising. So, undeterred from this brush with death, Forrest resumed his plant hunting until the following year when he returned to Scotland, got married, and then not long after, he met the acquaintance of John Charles Williams. The Williams family got in early during the Industrial Revolution and were at the center of all the mining that went on in Cornwall, the southwest bit of England. That probably doesn't mean much to anyone who doesn't know anything about what mining was to Cornwall, but the Williams family did quite well for themselves. They had massive land holdings, one of which was Caerhay's Castle, today a tourist attraction that's on my list. You might say John Charles Williams enjoyed horticulture, this science and art of growing plants, fruits, vegetables, usually but not always on a small controlled scale. And we all have our own little passions in life, and J.C. Williams, his was daffodils. His gardens at Caerhay's Castle were said to be among the finest in England. Not only were they stunning to walk around, but he carried out a lot of research there. And he was one of those people, in the tradition going back to Joseph Banks, who funded plant hunters to go out and make new discoveries that Williams and his people who worked for him would cultivate at his impeccable gardens on the grounds of his castle. Not bad. And he sure did bond with George Forrest. They really got on famously in every sense of the word, and he funded Forrest's third expedition to Yunnan. Arthur Bully had sent Forrest back again between November 1910 and March 1911, and he did some superb collecting for Bee's nursery. But now, like Ernest Wilson had done, he was leaving that dubious world of commercial collecting to do something more respectable. From here on out, his trips were funded by either Williams or other private institutions or people with a passion for these ornamental plants and a lot of money to burn. His third trip was from 1912 to 1915, then again 1917 to 1920, 1921 to 1923, and then a sixth time from January 1924 to March 1926. The sixth trip, like everyone George Forrest would take, was always to Yunnan, the mother lode for biodiversity and plants. The reason Forrest was so successful and so prolific was because of the team he had organized that was always led by one main guy, and everyone was local to the area that they explored. And even in between trips, when Forrest would be back in England or traveling elsewhere, they carried on with all the field work on Forrest's behalf. So when we hear that he discovered 30-something thousand plant specimens belonging to 233 families and discovering hundreds of new plant species and all the superlatives about his work with rhododendrons in particular and new species of azaleas, roses, and so many other flowering plants, it was more than one guy. In his own lifetime, George Forrest had been lucky to personally receive all the accolades, awards, recognition, and 49 times winning the Royal Horticultural Society's Award of Merit. 115 species were named for him with the Forresty species name. For his seventh and final trip to Yunnan province, it was the most well-funded of them all and had 39 individuals and institutions putting up money. Of all the trips to Yunnan that George Forrest would take, this one turned out to be the most productive of them all. In a land known as the Kingdom of Rhododendrons, Forrest stumbled into the find of his career, a rhododendron Sina Grande. In Chinese, it's called a tujian dujian. What the handkerchief tree was to Ernest Wilson, perhaps this rhododendron Sina Grande was to Forrest. It's also known as the Great Chinese Rhododendron. They can grow over 30 feet high, which in most places is more than 9 meters. The leaves alone can grow up to 3 feet long. It was quite a find, which I guess was the whole point of this world of plant hunting and funding plant hunters. Well, June 5th, 1932, that one thing travelers, especially those my age, fear the most, a medical crisis in the middle of nowhere, befell George Forrest when he suffered a massive heart attack and died right there in the hills of today's Tangchong. He was only 58 years old, but had managed to pack more life into those decades than most people. He was buried right there in Tangchong next to George Lytton's grave, Lytton having preceded him in death by 26 years. That location in Laifengshan today is a national park. The ruins of the cemetery are still there, but Forrest and Lytton's graves have been lost. Most people who know George Forrest's story will always say he never wrote a book about his adventures. Well, maybe he planned to one day. He lived an extremely exciting life, and much has been written about the relationships he made with the local plant collectors who were part of his team, and all the local indigenous people whose languages he tried to learn, and all the ways he tried to connect with them. It would have been a great book if George Forrest had lived to write it. Well, over the past 2 episodes, I think you all got the picture. There was also this going on while all the Chinese history we've looked at was happening in the foreground. So I hope this short series gave you some idea about this world of plant hunting during the Qing Dynasty. The focus was solely on some of the Western plant hunters. But before we shut things down, I just want to quickly mention Qian Shu. If there was any one single Chinese botanist that deserved a mention, it was Qian. He lived from 1883 to 1965. He spent a lot of time in the U.S., studying first at my alma mater, the University of Illinois, as well as the University of Chicago and Harvard. He came back to China and engaged in teaching and research for the remainder of his life. Qian Shu, along with Hu Xiansu, is called the father of modern botany in China as well as plant taxonomy. In 1933, both of these botanists became founding members of the Botanical Society of China, the Zhongguo Zhiwu Xuehui. Don't be misled. This whole field of botany was of worldwide interest, and though we may know about the exploits of these 19th and 20th century plant hunters introduced in this series, their counterparts were operating all over the world, and most certainly in China. And as Joseph Needham said in his great work, Chinese botanical exploration and research went back to the beginning of history. As the time in China got closer to July 1937, the golden age of plant collecting started to wind down. Once the Second Sino-Japanese War started, China wasn't the safest place to explore the countryside looking for new plant species. In their day, some of these plant hunters were quite celebrated. In our day, we've come to recognize that a lot of what they did, or perhaps the manner in which they did it, needs to be re-examined. To address the matter of climate change and other matters related to life on planet Earth, the 1992 Rio Convention on Biodiversity was held, and one of the many things addressed was the matter of living things. In breaking with the past, it was agreed that all living plants or animals are the property of the country where they were grown and lived. It outlawed the unauthorized collection and export of these specimens. What was once called plant hunting is now referred to as biopiracy or scientific colonialism. It's defined as the unauthorized appropriation of knowledge and genetic resources of farming and indigenous communities by individuals or institutions seeking exclusive monopoly control through patents or intellectual property. The beat goes on into our day, and powerful corporations are as difficult to rein in as they ever were. Well, why don't we gather up our things and let's call it a day. This is a very large topic, and if you wanted to dive deeper and explore the botanists and plant hunters and the individual species they discovered, this can be turned into its very own new podcast show. I hope all the botanists who took in this series aren't too alarmed that I didn't introduce most all of the Latin scientific names. Hey, I got to think of the group and not the individuals. Okay, that's going to be it. I thank you all for listening. Not sure how many of you stay till the very end. Statistically speaking, most listeners fade out of episodes long before they end. But not you. You're still here, giving me a little face. I thank you once again. Until the next time, tous mes beaux auditeurs, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from LA, California, inviting you to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.